Chapter 54 of Millbank. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michael Fazio. Millbank by Mary Jane Holmes. Roger and Magdalen. He was sleeping quietly, and his forehead was fully exposed to view, with the brown curls clustering around it, and an occasional frown or shadow flittering across it as if the pain were felt even in his sleep. How Magdalen's fingers tingled to thread those curls and smooth that broad white brow, but she dared not for fear of waking him, and she held her breath and stood looking at him as he slept, feeling a keen throb of sorrow as she saw how he had changed and knew what had changed him. He was much thinner than when she saw him last, and there were lines about his mouth and a few threads of silver in his brown beard, while his eyes, as he slept, seemed hollow and sunken. There was a stool just at her feet, and she pushed it to his side, and seating herself upon it, prepared to watch and wait until his heavy slumber ended. And while she waited, she looked around and noted all the marks of a refined taste which Roger had gathered about him. The books, the pictures, the flowers and shells, and lastly, a little crayon sketch of herself, drawn evidently from memory, and representing her as she sat by the river bank years ago, when first Roger Irving felt that his interest in his beautiful ward was more than a mere liking. It was hanging close to Jessie's picture, and Magdalen sat gazing at it until she forgot where she was, and was back again beneath the old tree by the river bank, with Roger at her side. Suddenly she gave a long, deep sigh, and then Roger awoke, and met the glance of her bright eyes, and saw her face so near to him, and knew that his long night of sorrow was over. Else she had never been there, kneeling by him as she was, with her hands holding his, and her tears dropping so fast as she tried to speak to him. "Magda, Magda, my darling," was all he could say, as he drew her into his arms and held her there a moment in a close embrace. Then, releasing her, he lay down upon his pillow, pale as death, and utterly prostrated with the neuralgic pain which the sudden excitement and surprise had brought back again. "You take my breath away. Why did you come, and why?" he asked. And then releasing her hands from his, Magdalen took the deed from her pocket, and changing her position, held it before his eyes, saying, "I came to bring this, Roger, to make restitution, to give you back Millbank, which, but for me, you would not have lost. See, it is made out to you. Millbank is yours again. I bought it with my own money. Bought it for you. I give it to you. It is yours." She spoke rapidly and kept reiterating that Millbank was his, because of the look on his face which she did not quite understand. He was too much bewildered and confounded to know what to say, and for a moment was silent, while his eyes ran rapidly over the paper, which, beyond a doubt, made him master of Millbank again. "Why did you do this, Magda?" he said at last, and his chin quivered a little as he said it. Then Magdalen burst out impulsively, "Oh, Roger, don't look as if you were not glad. I've thought so much about it, and wanted to do something by way of amends. I saved all my salary, every dollar, before I knew I was Magdalen Gray, and was going to send it to you, but Guy laughed me out of it, and said you did not need it. Then, when Father died, and I knew I was rich, my first thought was of you. And when I heard Millbank was to be sold, I said, I'll buy it for Roger if it takes every cent I am worth. And I have bought it, and given it to you, and you must take it and go back there and live. I shall never be happy till you do." She stopped there, but she was kneeling still, and her tearful, flushed face was very near to Roger, who could interpret her words and manner in only one way, and that a way which made the world seem like heaven to him. "Magda," he said, winding his arm around her and drawing her hot cheek close to his own, "let me ask you one question. I can't live at Millbank alone. If I take it of you, who will live there with me?" Hester had asked a similar question, but Magdalen did not reply to Roger just as she had to the old lady. There was a little dash of coquetry in her manner, which would not perhaps have appeared had she been less sure of her position. "I suppose Hester will live with you, of course," she said. "She does nicely for you here. She is not so very old." There was a teasing look in Magdalen's eyes, which told Roger he had nothing to fear, and raising himself up, he drew her down beside him and said, "I ask you to be candid with me, Magda. We have wasted too much time not to be in earnest now. Your coming to me as you have could only be construed in one way. Were you like most girls? But you are not. You are impulsive. You think no evil, see no evil, but do just what your generous heart prompts you to do. Now tell me, darling, was it sympathy and a desire to make restitution, as you designate it? Or was it love which sent you here when I had ceased to hope you would ever come? Tell me, Magda, can you love your old friend and guardian, who has been foolish enough to hold you in his heart all these many years, even when he believed himself indifferent to you?" Roger was talking in sober earnest, and his arm deepened its clasp around Magda's waist, and his lips touched the shining hair of the bowed head, which drew back a moment from him, then drooped lower and lower until it rested in his bosom, as Magdalen burst into a flood of tears and sobs. For a moment she did not try to speak. Then, with a desperate effort to be calm, she lifted up her head and burst out with, "I never got your letter, never knew it was written until a few weeks ago. Father kept it. Forgive him, Roger. Remember, he was my father, and he is dead." She cried vehemently as she saw the dark frown gathering on Roger's face. Yes, he was her father, and he was dead, and that kept Roger from cursing the man who had wronged him in his childhood through his mother, and had touched him still closer in his later manhood by keeping him so long from Magdalen. "Father told me at last," Magdalen said. "He was sorry he kept it, and he bade me tell you so. He did not dislike you. It was the name, the association, and he hoped I might forget you, but I didn't. I have remembered you all through the long years since that dreadful day when I found the will, and it hurt me so to think you wanted me to marry Frank. That was the hardest of all. But you know better now. I told you in my letter of Frank's confession," Roger said. And Magdalen replied, "Yes, I know better now. Everything is clear, else I had never come here to bring you Millbank. And myself, if you will take me. Will you, Roger? It is leap year, you know. I have a right to ask." She spoke playfully, and her eyes looked straight into his own, while for answer he took her in his arms and kissed her forehead and lips and hair. And she felt that he was praying silently over her, thanking heaven for this precious gift which had come to him at last. Then he spoke to her and said, "I take you, Magda, willingly, gladly. Oh, how gladly, heaven only knows, and I cannot well take you without the encumbrance of Millbank. I accept that too, and darling, though this may not be the time to say it, there has already been so much business and money and lands mixed up with our love, that I may, I am sure, tell you I am able of myself to buy the mill in Belvedere and the site of the old shoe shop. Frank wanted me to do it, and I put him off with saying I would wait until I knew who was to live at Millbank. I know now." And again he rained his kisses upon the face of her who was to be his wife and the undisputed mistress, as he was the master of Millbank. A long time they talked together of the past, which now seemed to fade away so fast in the blissful joy of the present, and Magdalen told him of little Roger Irving, whose godmother she was, and of her mother and Alice, and the home at Beechwood, where Guy Seymour's family would continue to live. "It is the same house my father built for Jessie, for your mother," Magdalen said, softly, and glanced up at the picture on the wall, whose blue eyes seemed to look down in blessing upon this pair to whom the world was opening so brightly. Then they talked of Frank and Belle and Mrs. Walter Scott, and by that time the summer sun was low in the western horizon, and Hester's tea-table was spread with every delicacy the place could afford, while Hester herself was fine and grand in her second-best black silk, which nothing less than Magdalen's arrival could have induced her to wear on a weekday. Guy, too, had made his appearance after waiting in vain for Magdalen's return. Hester remembered him, and welcomed him warmly, and told him the young folks was up chamber billin' and cooin' like two turtle-doves, whereupon Guy began to whisper Highland Mary, which Magdalen heard, and starting up, exclaimed, "There's Guy come for me. I must go now back to the hotel." But she did not go, for Roger would not permit it. and he kept her there that night, and the next day took her to his favorite place of resort, the rock under the pine, and seating her upon the mossy bank, knelt beside her, and gave thanks anew to heaven, who had heard and answered the prayer made so often under that tasseled pine, that if it were right, Magda should one day come to him as his. Then he went all over the farm and down to the mill, where some of the operatives who had lived in Belvedere and knew Magdalen came to speak with her, thus raising themselves in the estimation of the less favored ones, who gazed admirably at the beautiful young girl, rightly guessing the relation she held to Mr. Irving, and feeling glad for him. No repairs were needed at Millbank, and but few changes, so that the house was ready any time for its new proprietors, but Magdalen would not consent to going there as its mistress until September, for she wanted the atmosphere thoroughly cleared from the taint of Mrs. Walter Scott's presence, and it would take more than a few weeks for that. She liked Belle, and she pitied Frank, but Mrs. Walter Scott was her special aversion, and so long as she remained at Millbank, Magdalen could not endure even to cross its threshold. Still, it seemed necessary that she should do so before her return to Beechwood, and on the morning following the peaceful Sunday spent at Shoedick, she returned to Belvedere, which by this time was rife with the conjectures that Roger was coming back to Millbank, and Magdalen was coming with him. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of Millbank. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michael Fazio. Millbank by Mary Jane Holmes. Millbank is clear of its old tenants. That afternoon Magdalen went with Guy over the house, where she was met by Frank, and welcomed as the new mistress. Appropriating her at once to himself, Frank led her from room to room, seeming pleased at her commendations of the taste which had been displayed in the selection of furniture, and the care which had evidently been given to everything. "It was Belle," Frank said. "She is a good housekeeper, and after the split with Mother she attended to things. They had separate apartments, you know, at the last. Didn't speak a word, which I liked better than a confounded quarrel. I tell you, Magdalen, I've seen sights of trouble since you found that will, and I am happier today, knowing I've got out of the scrape, than I've been before in years." He seemed disposed to be very communicative, and was going on to speak of his domestic troubles, but Magdalen quietly checked him, and then asked where his mother was intending to go. "The mills of the gods grind slowly, but fine, exceedingly fine," Frank said. And then he told of his mother's fears for her money deposited in the bank of... There was a rumor that the bank had failed, but as it was only a rumor, he still hoped for the best. "At the first alarm, Mother went to bed," he said, "and she is there still, so you must excuse her not seeing you." Magdalen had no desire to see her, and when on her way to Beechwood she read in the paper of the total failure of the bank where Frank had told her his mother's money was deposited, and she did not greatly sympathize with the artful, designing woman, who almost gnashed her teeth when she, too, heard of her loss. She was all ready for removal to Rose Cottage, for which a friend was negotiating, and her trunks and boxes were packed with every conceivable valuable which could by any means be crowded into them: oil paintings, chromos, steel engravings, costly vases, exquisite shelves, knives, forks, spoons, china, cut glass, table linen, bed linen, and even carpets formed a part of her spoil, intended for that cottage, which now was not within her reach. There was still her oil stock left, and with that she might manage to live respectably, she thought. And resolving that no one should exult over her disappointment from any change they saw in her, she tried to appear natural, and when an attempt was made at sympathy, answered indifferently that she was sorry, of course, as she could have done so much good with the money, but the Lord knew what was best, and she must bear patiently what was sent upon her. This was what she said to her clergyman, who came to sympathize with her. But when he was gone, she looked the house over again, to see if there was anything more which she could take, and in case of necessity turn into money. Some one in Belvedere wrote to Roger that the house at Millbank was being robbed, and advised strongly that means be taken to prevent further depredations, and a few days after Mrs. Walter Scott was met in the hall by a stern-looking man, who said he came, at Mr. Irving's request, to take an inventory of all the articles of furniture in the house, and also to remain there and see that nothing was harmed or removed. He laid great stress on the last word, and the lady grew hot and red, and felt that she was suspected, and looked upon as a thief, and resented it accordingly. But after that there was no more hiding of articles under lock and key, for the stranger always seemed to be present, and she knew that she was watched. And when he inquired for a small and expensive oil painting which Roger had bought in Rome, and an exquisite French chrono, and certain pieces of silver and cut glass which he had on his list as forming a part of the household goods he was appointed to care for, she found them, and gave them, one by one, into his hands. And so her stock of goods diminished, and she hastened to get away before everything was taken from her, and one morning in August finally departed for a boarding house in New York, where she intended staying until something better offered. As soon as she was gone, a bevy of servants came out from Beechwood, and Roger came from Shoedick to superintend them, and old Hester came to oversee him, and the renovating process went rapidly on, while crowds of the villagers flocked to the house, curious to see the costly articles of furniture which, during the last few years, had been constantly arriving, and of which the house was full to overflowing. The mill was Roger's now, as well as the site of the old shoe shop. He had bought them both on the day of their sale, and the operatives of the mill had hurrahed with might and main for their new master, never heeding the old one, who still remained in town, and who, whatever he might have felt, put a good face on the matter, and seemed as glad and as interested as the foremost of them. Only once did he manifest the slightest feeling, and that was when with Roger he entered Belle's sleeping room, where the silken curtains were hanging and the many expensive articles of the toilet were still lying as Belle had left them. Then sitting down by the window, he cried, and when Roger looked at him questioningly, he told of his little boy born in that room, and dead before it was born. Belle was glad, he said. She does not like children, but I was so sorry, for if that boy had lived I should have been a better man. But it died, and Belle has left me, and mother's gone, and my money's gone, and I am a used-up dog generally, he added bitterly, and then with a sudden dashing away of his tears he brightened into his former self, and said laughingly, "But what's the use of fretting? I shall get along some way. I always have, you know." In his heart he knew Roger could not let him suffer, and when Roger said as much by way of comforting him, he took it as a matter of course, and secretly hoped the governor would give him something handsome, and let him keep a horse. End of chapter 55. Chapter 56 of Millbank. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michael Facio. Millbank by Mary Jane Holmes. The Bridal. Millbank was ready at last for its new mistress. But few changes had been made, and these in the library and the suite of rooms set apart for the bride. Her tastes were simpler than Belle's, and some of the gorgeous trappings had been removed and soberer ones put in their place. The house at Shoedick had been despoiled of a portion of its furniture, which now formed a part of Millbank. Jessie's picture and the candle-box cradle were both brought back, and Hester had the little quilt safe in her trunk, and had bought a new gray satin dress for the wedding party to be given at Millbank, September 15th, the day after the bridal. The idea of gray satin Hester had gotten from Mrs. Penelope Seymour, who came to Millbank to see that everything was as it should be for the reception of her niece. She had stayed 3 days and nights, and Hester had admired her greatly and copied her dress, and had it made in Springfield, and fitted over hoops and cotton, and then tried to fix up Alec into something a little more modern. But Alec was incorrigible, and would wear his short pants and cowhide shoes tied with leather strings, and so she gave him up, and comforted herself with the fact that he stayed mostly in his room, and would not run much risk of being laughed at by the grandees expected with the bridal party from New York. Roger had already gone to Beechwood, where Magdalen was waiting for him. It was his first visit there, and there were strange thoughts crowding upon his mind as he rode up the mountainside toward the house which had been built for his mother, and whither she once hoped to come as a bride. Now she was dead, her grave the ocean bed, her shroud the ocean grass, and he, her son, was going for his bride, the daughter of Arthur Gray. "Surely the ways of Providence are inscrutable. Who can know them?" he said, just as a turn in the road brought the house and grounds fully into view, together with Magdalen, who, in her evening dress of white, was standing on the piazza, her face glowing with health and beauty and eager expectation. Very joyfully she received him, and leading him into the house, presented him to Alice and her aunt, and then went for her little nephew, whom she brought to his Uncle Roger. They were a very merry party at Beechwood that night, and not a shadow rested on the hearts of anyone. It was better that Laura should be gone, better for her, better for them all, and when Magdalen saw how white Roger turned at the sight of her father's picture, she felt that it was well perhaps that he too was dead, for the two men could not have been wholly congenial to each other. The bridal was the next day but one, and Magdalen in her plain traveling dress was very beautiful, as she pledged herself to the man whose face wore a look of perfect peace and thankfulness as he clasped her hand and knew it was his forever. He made no demonstrations before the people, but when for a moment they were alone, as she went up for her hat and shawl, he opened his arms to her, and clasping her tightly to his bosom, showered his kisses upon her face and hands and hair, and called her his precious wife, his darling, won at last after many years of sorrow. They went to New York that night, and the next day arrived at Millbank, with Mrs. Seymour, Guy, and Alice, and a few friends, the Dagons and Dragons, whose quiet, unostentatious elegance of manner created quite as great a sensation as Mrs. Walter Scott's more showy guests had done when her son was the groom and Belle Burleigh the bride. Roger had given his men a holiday, and had ordered a dinner for them upon the Millbank grounds, but he had not hinted at a demonstration or bonfire, and was surprised when the New York train came round the bend in the meadow to see the crowds and crowds of people assembled before the depot, some on the fence, some on the woodpile, some on the platform, and all glad and excited and eager to see him. The Belvedere band was there also, and preceded the carriage up to the house, which had never seemed so pleasant and desirable to Roger as now, when he came back to it with Magdalen, and felt that both were his beyond a possibility of doubt. Old Hester received them, and no one but herself was allowed to remove the bride's wrappings, or conduct her to her room. Hester was in her element, and Mrs. Walter Scott never bore herself more proudly than did the old lady on that eventful day, when she seemed suddenly to have grown young again, and to be in every place at once, her cap-strings flying behind her, and her black silk pinned about her waist. The gray was reserved for the evening, when, instead of a party proper, to which a few were bidden, a general reception was held, which all were welcome to attend. There was a great crowd, for rich and poor, old and young, plebeian and aristocrat, came to pay their respects to the newly married pair, but not a rude thing was done, nor a rough word spoken by anyone. Roger himself did not know them all, and Magdalen only a few, but her greeting was just as cordial to one as to another. Her traveling dress had been very plain, but this evening she was radiant in white satin and lace and pearls, with the bridal veil floating back from her head, and the orange wreath crowning her shining hair, and those who had never seen such dress and style before held their breath in wonder, and for months after talked with pride of the night when all the town was permitted to see and shake hands with the sweet lady of Millbank, Mrs. Roger Irving. Roger had forbidden a bonfire, but there were lanterns hung in the trees all over the grounds, and the young people danced there upon the floor which had been temporarily laid down, until midnight was past, and the moon so high in the horizon that the glare of lamps was no longer needed to light up the festal scene. Mrs. Franklin Irving had been invited to be present, but she wisely declined, and sent instead a most exquisite ring to Magdalen, who let Frank put it upon her finger and kiss her hand as he did so, a privilege he claimed because the ring was said to be his gift and Belle's. His wife had conceded so much to him, though Frank had known nothing of the ring until he saw it in his velvet box on his wife's bureau. Unlike her, he had no feelings of delicacy to prevent his being present at Roger's bridal party. With no business on his hands and nothing to expect from his wife besides his board, he was quite as willing to stay at Millbank as in Boston, and seemed to take it for granted that he was welcome there. And nobody cared much about his movements, except Hester, who wondered why the lazy lout didn't go to work and earn his own victuals, instead of hanging on to Roger. She vummed as if she'd stand it much longer. She'd set him to work if Roger didn't. And so, as time went on and Frank still lingered about the place, Hester gradually impressed him into her service, and made him do some of the things which Alec once had done and which he was unable to do now. Sometimes he brought water for her, or split her kindlings, or went to the village on an errand, and did it willingly too, though he always wore his gloves, and generally carried his cane and eyeglass, which last article he had of late adopted. It was Magdalen who finally interfered and stood between Hester and Frank, and said he was welcome to remain at Millbank as long as he chose, and that if Hester had not servants enough, another should be procured at once. This was the first and only time that Magdalen asserted her right as mistress in opposition to old Hester, who submitted without a word, and ever after left Frank in peace. September passed quickly, and in the late October days, when the New England woods were gorgeous with crimson and gold, and Millbank was still beautiful with its autumn flowers, Mrs. Franklin Irving came up to visit Mr. and Mrs. Roger, and was received by them with all the cordiality due so near a relative. Not by a word or look did she betray the slightest regret for the past, when she had been mistress where she was now only a guest. Millbank was to her as any stranger's house, and she bore herself naturally and pleasantly, and made herself very agreeable to Roger, and devoted herself to Magdalen, whom she liked so much, and was civil and almost kind to her husband, who was still there, and, as Hester said, just as shiftless as ever. Belle saw the state of affairs, and while she despised her husband more than ever for his indolence and lack of sensibility, she resolved to give Magdalen a rest, and leave her alone with Roger for a time. So when in November she returned to Boston, she invited Frank to go with her, and secured him a place as bookkeeper in a merchant's counting house, and stimulated perhaps by the perfect happiness and confidence she had seen existing between Roger and Magdalen, tried by being kind and even deferential to him, to mold him into something of which she would not be so terribly ashamed as she was now of the careless, shambling, listless, lazy man, whom everybody knew as Mrs. Franklin Irving's husband. End of chapter 56.
Chapter 57 of Millbank. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Millbank by Mary Jane Holmes. Christmastide. It was the second Christmas after Magdalen's bridal, and fires were kindled in all the rooms at Millbank, and pantries and closets groaned with their loads and loads of eatables. And Hester Floyd bustled about, important as ever, ordering everybody except the nurse who had come with Mrs. Guy Seymour and her baby, the little 4-month-old girl whose name was Laura Magdalen, and who, with her warm milk and cold milk and numerous paraphernalia of babyhood, kept the kitchen a good deal stirred up, and made Hester chafe a little inwardly. But then she said, she supposed she must get used to these things, and her face cleared up, and her manner was very soft and gentle every time she thought of the crib in Magdalen's room, where, under the identical quilt the poor heathen would never receive, slumbered another baby girl, Magdalen's and Roger's, which had come to Millbank about 6 weeks before, and over whose birth great rejoicings were made. Jessie Morton was its name, and Guy and Alice had stood for it the Sunday before, and with Aunt Pen were to remain at Millbank through the holidays, and help Magdalen to entertain the few friends invited to pass the week under Roger's hospitable roof. The world had gone well with Roger since he came back to Millbank. Everything had prospered with which he had anything to do. The shoe shop had been rebuilt, and the mill was never more prosperous, and Roger bade fair soon to be as rich a man as he had supposed himself to be before the will was found. On his domestic horizon, no cloud, however small, had ever rested. Magdalen was his all in all, his choicest treasure, for which he daily thanked heaven more fervently than for all his other blessings combined. And amid his prosperity, Roger did not forget to render back to heaven a generous portion of his gifts, and many a sad heart was made glad, and many a poor church and clergymen were helped quietly, unostentatiously, and oftentimes so secretly that they knew not whence came the aid, but for which they might have given up in utter despair and hopelessness. Magdalen approved and assisted in all her husband's charities, and her heart went out after the sad, sorrowful ones, with a yearning desire to make them as happy as herself. Especially was this the case that Christmas time, when to all her other blessings a baby had been added, and she made it a season for extra gifts to the poor and needy, who through all the long winter would be more comfortable because of her generous remembrance. When the list of guests to be invited for the holidays was being made out, she sat for a moment by Roger's side, with her eyes fixed musingly on the bright fire in the grate. Mr. and Mrs. Franklin Irving's names were on the list, with that of Grace and the young clergyman to whom she was engaged, and Roger waited for Magdalen to say if there was any one else whom she would have. "Yes, Roger, there is. Perhaps you won't approve, but I should like to ask Mrs. Walter Scott, if you don't object too much. She has a dreary time at best, and this will be a change. She may not come, it's true, but she will be pleased to know we remember her." Roger had entertained the same thought, but refrained from giving expression to it from a fear lest Magdalen would not like it, and so that day a cordial invitation to pass the holidays at Millbank was forwarded to the boarding house in New York, which Mrs. Walter Scott was actually keeping as a means of support. Her oil had failed, as well as the bank which held her money. There might be something for her some time, perhaps, but there was nothing now, was the report of the lawyer employed to investigate the matter. And then she began to realize how utterly destitute she was. Frank could not help her, and as she was too proud to ask help of Roger, she finally did what so many poor, discouraged women do, opened a boarding house in a part of the city where she would not be likely to meet any of her former friends, and there, in dull, dingy rooms with forlorn, half-worn furniture and faded drapery, all relics like herself of former splendors, she tried to earn her living. The goods which she managed to smuggle away from Millbank served her a good turn now, and pawnbrokers and buyers of old silver and pictures soon made their acquaintance of the tall lady with light hair and traces of great beauty, who came so often to their shops, and seemed so sad and desolate. Roger and Magdalen had been to see her once, and Frank had been many times, but Belle never deigned to notice her, though she was frequently in New York, and once drove past the boarding house in a stylish carriage, with her velvets and ermine around her. Mrs. Walter Scott did not see her, and so that pang was spared her. She had finished her book, but the publishers, one and all, showed a strange obtuseness with regard to its worth, and it was put away in her trunk, where others things pertaining to the past were buried. The invitation from Millbank took her by surprise, and made her cry a little, but she hastened to accept it, and was there before her daughter-in-law and an occupant of her former room. She was old and broken, and faded and poor, and seemed very quiet, and very fond of Magdalen's baby, which she kept a great deal in her room, calling herself its grandma, and thinking, perhaps, of another little one whose loss no one had regretted save Frank, the father. He came at last with Belle, who was very polite and gracious to her mother-in-law, whom she had not expected to meet. "Of course, I am sorry for her," she said to Magdalen, who was one day talking of her, and wishing something might be done to better her condition. "But what can I do? She refuses to receive money from me, and as for having her in my house, no power on earth could induce me to do that." Alas for Belle! Man proposes, but God disposes, and the thing which no power on earth could induce her to do was to be forced upon her whether she would have it or not. The Christmas dinner was a sumptuous one, and after it was over the guests repaired to the parlors, where music and a little dance formed a part of the evening's entertainment. Mrs. Walter Scott was playing for the dance. Her fingers had not yet forgotten their skill, and she had good-naturedly offered to take the place of Grace Burley, who gave up the more willingly because of the young clergyman looking over a book of engravings and casting wistful glances towards her. Whether it was the dinner, or the excitement, or a combination of both, none could tell, but there was suddenly a cessation of the music, a crash among the keys, and Mrs. Walter Scott turned toward the astonished dancers, a face which frightened them. It was so white, so strange, and so distorted. Paralysis of one entire side was the verdict of the physician, who was summoned immediately, and did all he could for the stricken woman, from one half of whose body the sense of feeling was gone, and who lay in her room as helpless as a child. Gradually her face began to look more natural. Her speech came back again, thick and stammering, but tolerably intelligible, and her limp right hand moved feebly, showing that she was in part recovering. For 3 weeks they nursed her with the utmost care, and Belle stayed by and shrank from the future which she saw before her, and from which she wished so much to escape. In her womanly pity and sympathy, Magdalen would have kept the paralytic woman at Millbank, but Roger was not willing that her young life should be burdened in this way, and he said to Frank and Belle, "Your mother's place is with her children. If you are not able to take care of her, I am willing to help, but I cannot suffer Magdalen to take that load of care." So it was settled, and Belle went home to Boston and prepared an upper room, which overlooked the common, and then came back to Millbank, where they made the invalid ready for the journey. Her face was very white, and there was a look of dreary despair and dread in her eyes, but she uttered no word of protest against the plan, and thanked Roger for his kindness, and kissed the little Jessie, and cried softly over her, and whispered to Magdalen, "Come and see me often. It is the only pleasant thing I can look forward to." And then Frank and Roger carried her out to the carriage, which took her to the cars, and that night she heard the winter wind howl around the windows of the room, to which she felt that she was doomed for life, and which, taking that view of it, seemed to her like a prison. "The Lord is sure to remember, first or last," old Hester said as she watched the carriage moving slowly down the avenue, "and though I can't say I would have given her the shaken palsy if I'd have been the Lord, I know it right and just, and a warning to all liars and deceitful snooping critters." Still, Hester was sorry for the woman, and went to see her almost as often as Magdalen herself, and once stayed 3 whole weeks, and took care of her when Mrs. Franklin was away. Belle did not trouble herself very much about her mother-in-law, or spend much time with her. She gave orders that she should be well cared for, and have everything she wished for, and she saw that her orders were obeyed. She also went once a day to see her and ask if she was comfortable, but after that she felt that nothing further was incumbent upon her. And so, for all Mrs. Walter Scott knew of the outer world and the life she had once enjoyed so much, she was indebted to Grace, who before her marriage passed many hours with the invalid, telling her of things which she thought would interest her, and sometimes reading to her until she fell asleep. But after Grace was gone, Mrs. Walter Scott's days passed in dreary loneliness and wretched discontent. She had no pleasure in recalling the past, and nothing to look forward to in the future. The remainder of her wretched life she knew must be passed where she was not wanted, and where her son came but once a day to see her, and that in the evening just after dinner, when he usually fell asleep while she was trying to talk to him. Belle would not suffer Frank to go into the city evenings unless she accompanied him, for she had no fancy for having him brought to her in a state of intoxication, as was once the case. And Frank, who was a good deal afraid of her, remained obediently at home, and, preferring his mother's society to that of his wife, stayed in the sick-room a portion of every evening. Then, when wholly wearied there, went to his own apartment, and smoked in dreary solitude until midnight. Such was Frank's life, and such the life of his mother, until there came to her a change in the form of a second shock, which rendered one hand and foot entirely helpless, and distorted her features so badly that she insisted that the blind should be kept closed and the curtains down, so that those who came into her room could not see how disfigured she was. And so in darkness and solitude her days passed drearily, with impatient longings for the night. And when the night comes, she moans and weeps, and wishes it was morning. Poor woman! She is a burden to herself, and a terrible skeleton to her fashionable daughter-in-law, who, in the gayest scenes in which she mingles, never long forgets the paralytic at home, sinking so fast into utter imbecility, and as she becomes more and more childish and helpless, requiring more and more care and attention. The curse of wrongdoing is resting on Belle as well as on her husband and his mother, and though she is proud and haughty and reserved as ever, she is far from being happy, and her friends say to each other that she is growing old and losing her brilliant beauty. Frank often tells her of it when he has been drinking wine. He is not afraid of her then, and after he found that it annoyed her, he delighted to tease her about her fading beauty, and to ask why she could not keep as young and fresh and handsome as Magdalen. There was not a wrinkle in her face, he said, and she looked younger and handsomer than when he first came home from Europe and saw her at the exhibition. And well might Magdalen retain her girlish beauty, for if ever the fountain of youth existed anywhere, it was in her home at Millbank, exceedingly popular with the villagers, idolized by her husband, perfectly happy in her baby, surrounded by every luxury which wealth can furnish, and every care lifted from her by old Hester's thoughtfulness. There has as yet been no shadow, however small, upon her married life, and her face is as fair and beautiful, and her voice as full of glee as when she sat with Roger by the riverside, and felt the first awakenings of the love which has since grown to be her life. And now we say farewell to Millbank, knowing that when sorrow comes to its inmates, as it must some day come, it will not be such a sorrow as enshrouds that gloomy house in Boston, for there is perfect love and faith between the husband and the wife, with no sad, dreary retrospects of wrong to make the present unendurable. End of chapter 57. Read by Mama Fish, February 13th, 2025, in San Antonio, Texas. End of Millbank by Mary Jane Holmes.